announcements which involve beverages. So I'll start with that news. We're going to do this session until 5:30. Okay, it's an open dialogue. Madeleine and Lisa Davis will be facilitating the space in the room for us to brainstorm together. So let's keep our comments short and fluid so as many people can participate as possible. The social evening starts at 5:30. It's a reception in the Delegates Lounge, and we will be escorted there together. And then afterwards, there's some free time and let's call it an after party or a continuation of some social, relaxed, very informal engagement at this bar called Mr. Pickwick's, and there'll be maps at the back of the room so you can pick up if you're going for dinner with groups afterwards. If you would like to join people for dinner and you don't have people, please come and look for some of us WILPFers at the end of the session, and we can go in small groups for dinner or eat at the pub. Okay? Hanan made the intervention on Palestine, and you are all invited to sign on a solidarity message at the back of the room. They're preparing it now, and if you are able to, please sign on to that solidarity message with the prisoners in Palestine. I think that's it. Tomorrow is at a separate, different venue that required RSVP to enter. So those of you who have already RSVP'd, that will be how you enter, and the address is already on the agenda. Thank you to everyone who's joining us on live stream and cooperating with our very flexible schedule here in Geneva. The live stream will finish at 5 p.m. Geneva time. If you have comments or questions, we will try and facilitate those in the first hour of this discussion. And otherwise, it'll be an open format. So Madeleine and Lisa, are you ready? Can you everyone shout Madeleine's name? Louder! Madeleine!
Hang on. Are you trying to get my attention or something? Where is everybody? Anybody not in the room doesn't get a free drink tonight, courtesy of the Swedes. It's a feminist foreign policy. Because we're short on time, we're going to shift the way we were going to do things a little bit, and because I've already forgotten what it was because women of a certain age, I'm going to ask Lisa to tell you how we're going to do this. Can you remember?
Well, this is the best part of the day, because this is the part where we're going to come up with our recommendations, with our strategies for how we want to see the UN change so we can reclaim it as a peace organization. Now, some of these recommendations have already come out. We've talked about the problems. We've talked about some of the ways it needs to change. And then tomorrow, we're going to start identifying what's practical, what we can do now, what's more long-term, and how we're going to advocate for those changes. So this is the best part of the day, because this is the part where we get to design our ideal UN system. Tomorrow, we talk about the long haul of how to make it happen. Sound like a good plan?
Yes.
Good? You with me? So Madeleine and I also decided that we didn't want to be behind the podium, because this is a conversation between all of us. So this is our portable mic.
Sort of.
Sort of. And we're going to walk around a little bit. I know that we want to start by thinking about what were the recommendations that came out of your working groups? What were some of the things that we've talked about today in terms of how we're going to change, how the UN should change? Start thinking about it, because there's been a lot of great recommendations that have been made, and we need to bring them all together. We need to collate them. And V is going to write them up on the screen. We're going to just start it with English, but unless V wants to work on her Arabic. But we'll get it translated so everyone has it, so we can look at them in Arabic tomorrow, or in other languages, French or Spanish or anything else anyone needs. But today we want to start throwing it up so we can have them. And we're going to ask, to start us off, we're going to ask Iman if she wants to share with us one of her recommendations for how to change the UN to reclaim it as a peace organization.
شكرا جزيلا للرابطة.
I would like to thank WILPF for giving us this opportunity, and I start by introducing myself. I am lawyer Iman Abdurrahman, chair of the leadership leading women in Iraq, and I would like to start with giving you a brief idea of our work in Iraq on peace and security and women's participation. Iraq has a national plan that was adopted in 2014, and although the plan was adopted, the government did not implement part of that plan and did not provide it with the necessary financial support. The plan was adopted before ISIS entered Iraq. When ISIS entered Iraq, organizations started adopting an urgent plan, and they took 2 points from the previous plan, which are participation and protection. Meanwhile, Iraq had submitted to CEDAW its report, which included 67 recommendations. 67 recommendations, and those recommendations covered several dimensions. Today we have discussed the different mechanisms, and we wondered whether these mechanisms are effective and whether they allow for holding governments accountable. And the government, instead of taking these recommendations into account, did exactly the opposite. First of all, in terms of reconciliation, we have 4 reconciliation commissions, and women did not participate in any of them. Regarding the minors' marriage, this is one of the catastrophes we have in Iraq, and nothing was done in that regard. As for harmful practices against women, unfortunately, a special law was adopted. Is there a problem? Microphone, please.
You made a great point.
لقد أدليتي بنقطة.
I don't want to lose it. And also, we want to make sure we have time for everyone to be able to talk, because we don't have a lot of time. But you made a great point about the UN. You said that when Iraq went up for review to CEDAW, Iraq did nothing to do any of the implementation of any of the recommendations from CEDAW, right? And then we were getting into what those recommendations were. Well, maybe that's something we want to talk to the UN about changing. Maybe one of our priorities needs to be that the UN needs to adhere to recommendations by its treaty bodies. That recommendations that come out of treaty bodies needs to be the UN's priority of what they're implementing in country. And I bet if we look at some of those recommendations for different countries, what we'll see is hypocrisy. We'll see the UN doing things that are actually not in line with treaty body recommendations. So we need to change that, and we need to make sure that the UN is prioritizing treaty body recommendations, because we often get good recommendations that are never implemented by the country. And there's a role the UN can play in terms of its support in implementation of those recommendations. How does that sound for one? Good? Oh, great, it's already up. Do we have another one? What else do we want to see the UN do differently? That was a great and very practical recommendation. Barbara.
Good. Does this work? Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to pick up on what Iman was saying in terms of recommendation and how this can link into other ongoing processes, for instance, in Iraq. And then part of the discussions that we had in the political economy group was how the UN relates to other actors, and in particular how it relates to economic actors that comes in. In particular, when it comes to Iraq, for instance, The Iraqi government has recently gone into an agreement with the World Bank around a 1.2 billion program around reconstruction, in which there has been barely no consultation with women and civil society. There's been minor consultations with the UN in that process. So you have a full-on project in Iraq going into what is called reconstruction of the Iraq economy, reconstruction of infrastructure, and also reforms within the Iraqi Ministry of Economy in particular. And so what we discussed in particular also is that we need a closer relationship between the UN and the economic actors, and connecting that also with consultations with women and civil society groups, because now it's a complete absence. You have the political processes in which is also neglected by the UN. You have the economic processes that are disconnected from the UN, and you have economic processes that are disconnected from the needs of the society. So none of these plans, none of these recommendations coming from CEDAW, from the 1325 action plan, from the social and sort of legal justice reform plans that are being discussed is coming into the very institutions that are paying or at least providing money into the system. So this link between the UN and its so-called collaborative partners is necessary.
What do we think of that? Having, I see some hands going up, so let me just frame the question. Do we like the recommendation of the UN coordinating with international finance institutions and international finance institutions prioritizing civil society consultation? Before we take comments, I just want to see if there's some head nods of yes, but, or yes? Okay, good. So I'm going to say this, and then we're going to go to 2 points. We have some hands up, that this is a collaborative process. That's what movement building is all about. Part of this session is coming up with recommendations we all agree on so that we can say that this is a movement building power behind these recommendations when we present them to the UN. Okay, right here.
Manal Behna. I want to add. I want to talk about 2 points. The first point is really very close to what the lady over there said about the coordination and collaboration between the UN agencies on the ground. We have been in this problem since 2003. We have several UN agencies over there, but we usually in a lag of their coordination and collaboration with themselves and with the government and with the civil society. It happened, but it doesn't happen really in a very, let us say, monthly basis or bi-monthly basis. So this is very good thing in need. For emergency, the second point, for the emergency cases, Mosul now is in a very critical situation. So in emergency cases, we need the interfere to be very fast, very quantitative and qualitative in order not to get into another conflict from another kind. So this is another thing. Is emergency should be treated as an emergency, not to wait for the conflict to happen. Thank you.
That folks were making yesterday, that the UN needs to be proactive, not responsive, not reactive, right? So do we like both these points? I think we do. Okay, good. All right.
So you said proactive but not militarized?
Not reactive.
But proactive but not militarized is the word I'm saying, because the response usually is, oh, we'll send in a military. That's not
right, and it's getting conflict prevention before, instead of just responding to after conflict erupts. Okay, Raja.
Hi. I have a number of ideas. In terms of one of the priorities that we repeated was inclusive participation. And when we say inclusive participation, always when the UN comes to our countries, it repeatedly says that, but they never implement it into their own planning. So for example, UNDAF, the UN Development Assistance Framework that they develop for each country, it's not done in an inclusive way with women groups in that country. It's only, if we are lucky, they have a dialogue with the state. Sometimes they don't even consult the state. So UNDAF, human response plans, and even World Bank and IMF plans and consultations, they should have a component of civil society, especially women-led and women's rights organizations. Action plans, not only 1325, we always support action plans for 1325. We need action plans to implement CEDAW recommendations. This is something, when I was in 2007, we had a CEDAW meeting for Yemen to discuss Yemen, and I went there as part of the delegation for civil society. And I had a meeting with UNIFEM, and they advised us to go back to our country to lobby to have that action plan. And we lobbied, and they developed that action plan to implement CEDAW recommendation. But the UN system had a shock when they saw it, and they didn't support it. Not UNFPA, UNICEF, all the UN agencies practically, because that was something maybe new, it was not supported. For the arms transfer, I think it's about time to have a shame list to put countries on this shame list. Not only we have a shame list for the children violators, rights violators. Now we need a shame list for the countries who transfer arms, whether it is illicit or official. They have to be in that list, and we have to develop plans so that they are being removed from that shame list. When there is always, we talk about when we have anything. So for example, when we say we want civil society to work with civil society, sometimes one of the major issues in our countries was corruption. When UN agencies came, they always created these parallel systems where they channel their money. They didn't work on building and strengthening the state institutions. We want empowering the civil society and also supporting the state institutions and supporting gender equality in both streams. We cannot choose one stakeholder and ignore, because I keep hearing this. For example, the World Bank country engagement note, it emphasizes so much about inclusivity and even service provision through the civil society. That's great. But we need to also make our state come back. I feel like I don't have a state. We have so many governments now. Of course, yeah, you know, so many actors, so many service providers, but we need the state to come back as it's how it looks. We don't, last point. We haven't really seen any reparation programs in our region, especially that target women. Always when we are doing negotiations and political dialogue, all the funds is focusing on the political dialogue, but nothing on the actual transitional justice programs that will support in reconciliation and help people recover and have sustainable peace. And we haven't really had a model of a reparation in the region at all. It is about time to have that kind of example. Thank you.
Nations good? Everybody's good with them? Okay. You want to?
No, just to say that we always emphasize CEDAW. Can we also mention the other treaty bodies, because they're much broader in reach, and also when we're looking at the whole reparations as we're going to, we really need to look at social, cultural and economic rights as being a way forward for women in particular.
Okay, there are lots of hands. I'm going to try to give folks who haven't had a chance to speak yet a chance to speak, and then we'll go to folks for a second turn. So I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to start. And then I can't count any higher than that.
We're all right.
But we'll get there. Where do we go? 1 in the very back, and then working our way forward.
Mike.
Sorry, I'll go back again to CEDAW, and I want the UN to put pressure on our countries to submit their reports. Morocco, for example, has 2 reports pending. Also, the UPR, it is holistic, it's good, but at the end of the day, it is a mechanism which is not very effective because it's government to government, and this has to be, I don't know, revised or revisited. But again, concerning the money or the funding allocated or to UN, for example, or locally, they are in Morocco, for example, they tend to work more or to fund more state institutions, and only very little small amounts of money go to civil society. Thank you.
Okay, we have right here.
Hi, my name is Joni van der Zand. I coordinate the Global Men Engage Alliance. I'm just going to share 2 points that came out of the gender equality conversation that we had yesterday, 2 very kind of concrete recommendations that came out of the group. One of them was on ECOSOC accreditation, which is a very important, concept for civil society participation in various UN conferences, including the Commission on the Status of Women. And news is coming out that there's a lot of actually conservative or regressive organizations that are getting ECOSOC status now at the expense of more progressive and feminist-informed organizations. So recommendation there to rethink those models for accreditation, and how can the UN really make a choice in supporting those organizations that uphold the UN Charter, maybe rather than just what some conservative governments want. Second point, building on that is access of civil society organizations at conferences more broadly, including, again, the Commission on the Status of Women. We know that at last CSW, at 6 o'clock, organizations where civil society representatives were put outside the rooms while the negotiations were ongoing. So how can we prevent that in the future, and how can we rethink the models and really put our foots down for civil society participation there?
Right, we need access. We need civil society access to the UN if we're going to be able to utilize it. Gorna.
Okay, it's working. I just want to point out sort of thing that, in my opinion, we are making a mistake. We call for civil society, and we are all here civil society. It's the question of the class as well, and we have to acknowledge our privilege. So we're not recognizing what we mean under civil society. So that's the first thing. We can go that the second, with respect to women and civil society advising, it needs to be wider. When we talk about civil society, we either need wider. The second point is, which is written now under the tools as a second point, why so much money, why so much funding to state, not civil society. Again, Raja was pointing out from Yemen previously, it's the question of, are we building different states rather than civil society taking over responsibility for services from the state? Do we really want to have civil society that provides the services? That's the question. And I really think not, because that is, and we've seen that all over again and again. I mean, you get funding, then the funding withdraws, and all the services and provision that civil society took on itself just disappears. So just want to address the question of what do we consider as a state, what do we actually really acknowledge as a civil society, and we need, in my opinion, to address really this privileged position that we act on as well.
Yes, sorry for taking you back, we are on the recommendation number 2, but I kind of got the word later. So what I wanted to add to the fact the UN and economic actors must become mutually responsible for consulting women, I just want to add to that I would think that UN also needs to be responsible, not just with respect to including the women, but respect to have their accountability with respect to human rights. And I want us to look at the link, because when we are reforming economies in a country, we're not just reforming the economy, we should, at least we should be reforming economies in a way that we prevent future conflicts, which means that we should not just be dealing with, economic reforms, as I mentioned previously in the panel, through austerity measures. Actually, we shouldn't be doing that at all, but look into how, and this is, I think, UN has, at least in Bosnia, has not maintain that responsibility and should be reminded to do so. So, for example, when we go into economic reforms, they need to hold EU, for example, in Bosnia's case, or the other IFIs, accountable to what happens to universal health care. For sure, when countries coming out of the conflict, we've had people for such a long time being deprived of health care. For sure, that's a thing that UN must remind the EFIs that this is something that should not be taken away from the discussions of the economic reforms. And this is also the link between every country's obligation to address the harms people have suffered, and how we then put that question of reparations further into the economic reform. So I would like that. So it's not just about us participating, but also about the content we are bringing into that participation, which also means that recommendation number 10, reparations for women, I would strongly recommend that to be reparations for civilian victims of harms, because we cannot create that hierarchies between the civilian victims of war, women on one side, men, torture victims here. It has to be a coherent reparations program for civilian victims of war overall, connected to the economic reforms countries coming out of the conflict necessarily will be going through. Thanks.
Thank you, Nella.
I think if we talk about reclaiming the United Nations, then we have not only to speak about the conflict-afflicted regions and countries, but the driving forces in the Security Councils, the veto powers, and those who, for different reasons, because they are revitalizing the Cold War, again, and all these mechanisms of militarization, power politics, and they are inviting countries such as mine, Heidi from Germany, to strive for, since years, to be a member of the Security Council, a permanent member, just to be into this power structure. And the worst is that they believe that they are very much on conflict prevention and so on, and they are still the third arms trader in the world. I think if we talk about root causes, then we have to get rid of the veto powers, and we cannot make out of the UN something like a kind of better NATO for the whole world. This is really a danger, and the responsibility for us all, coming from the US, from Germany, from European countries, but also from Australia, that we have strongly to protest against this. And our recommendation is that this is one body for the countries in the world, and not just for veto powers.
All right, we'll go in the back, and then to Rula, and then we'll just work our way down.
Is it on? I can talk. Okay, so as you may know, Libya is listed as a priority country in many national action plan in various countries. So I would suggest that we should create, in consultation with the different stakeholders, international and regional, and also local and civil society, an action plan that targets the implementation of 1325 in Libya, because now there's a lot of funding about 1325, but now what creates, again, we talked about this, is the competition between the civil society organization and also the competition between the international actors to implement 1325. So I would say that to unite the efforts to actually implement 1325 in Libya, embrace the current initiatives of peace that is created by women in Libya, because we know that United Nations and the United Nations political peace dialogue, it ignored completely the existing initiatives that is inside the country and building on it and strengthening it. And also a feminist interpretation of the word localization, because localization is being used as excluding women, because now women inclusion is culturally sensitive. So we need a feminist and intersectional interpretation of the word localization. Thank you.
How many of you here are from countries which are on the list for the Security Council that have a mandate? So it's DRC.
Oh, repeat it.
Yeah, I want to know that how many of you from countries which are actively brought to the attention of the Security Council on a regular basis, and how many of you are in countries where there's a Chapter 7 mandate? Palestine, DRC, Iraq, Yemen, Nigeria. Because can I invite you then to say something about the formulation of those mandates, because we haven't got anything in here yet. We've got lots of bits and pieces, but one thing that really came out very strongly with talking with Annie from DRC was the way in which the mandates are developed are done from up here and has nothing to do with you, and therefore doesn't actually address the issues you were raising when it comes to implementation of a real peace plan. So I'm inviting you to have thoughts on that. Don't have to answer the question straight away, but just to have it in your head so we can get to it at some point.
Rolla?
Whenever I've interacted with senior UN officials and often criticize what's happening in the United Nations, they tell me it's not the UN, it's the member states. And then when you speak to the member states, they tell me it's the UN and the UN mechanism. So my question really is, if we think we can reclaim the United Nations, is the plan to do it interacting with the United Nations, or do we need to be working with member states in order to push for that reform? So what is the plan of attack in terms of, is it aimed at the UN or the member states is one point.
That's the conversation we're going to get into tomorrow. And when we flesh out our recommendations, we'll start to see how they group and how they work together and where the best strategies are in terms of who we're lobbying within the UN system.
Hello, sorry. I don't know if it was mentioned yesterday, apologies because I wasn't here. One of the things that is severely hampering the work of local groups in conflict and fragile affected states is the counterterrorism legislations and economic sanctions that are placed against these countries. The space for doing good is small and getting smaller. This is at a critical stage. Right now, most of us can't open bank accounts if we want to transfer funds to Turkey, to Syria, to Lebanon, to Yemen, to most of the countries that are crisis-stricken. So how are we to make a difference in these places of crises, whether they're fragile and coming into a crisis or whether they're at a crisis already, when we are not talking as civil society between us and mentioning this really critical point? Sorry, I don't know where it quite fits into this, but I feel it's a really important point that we can raise, and the UN has a big role to play in it.
It does fit, because even if we're talking about government initiatives, the UN can play a role to support our voices and to support the larger collective voices of civil society in their call to amend or abolish anti-terrorism laws that inhibit local groups from being able to get funding. So it certainly does have a point. And that's what we want to do. We want to think outside the box in terms of how we use the UN to work for us.
relates to peace and security in the sense that when we aren't able to provide aid and the services that are needed, and I heard this from someone, you know, the buildup of hatred right now against some of the countries like the United States, like UK, because they see them as withholders of aid, then you are building a society or a segment of society that is just fostering hate, and we know where hate leads to. So I think it really ties in with the peace and security issue.
I want to invite you to make that point again tomorrow, because that really will feed into our strategy of, you know, how we're presenting our arguments. So we had two hands down here. Yes. One, then two.
Thank you so much. I'm Nozizo Matlala Routledge from South Africa. Just looking at this list, I feel that we are making a list for the UN, what the UN must do. I really would like to see a list for ourselves saying what we must do to make the UN that we want. The conversation earlier this morning, looking at the feminist perspective on sustainable peace, gave us some real examples of how the UN has failed to build sustainable peace, and it continues to do so. In Colombia, in Bosnia. Today, South Africa celebrates Freedom Day, but for the majority of South Africans, they are saying we don't see this freedom. So I'm saying I really would like us to spend a time looking at how we strengthen ourselves, build solidarity among ourselves, so that we are able to make the UN listen. I didn't hear, for example, the reason why the Director General was not able to come today, because I really think he should have been here to hear us directly, to have heard the conversation this morning. I quite liked yesterday the conversation about how we get an integrated approach and also look at the modalities. And for me, those modalities should include not only understanding the rules of how the UN system works, but also looking at how we can bring a feminist perspective even to the formulation of those rules. But of course it becomes difficult, because if you look at that picture that the representative from the Director General's office showed us, where only one woman among so many men, that perspective would certainly not be listened to in that kind of situation. So we've got to work on how do we increase the critical mass in terms of the UN, the representation of women in UN structures, but also how to ensure a feminist agenda is infused into that, because it's not just a matter of bringing women simply because they are women.
You know, you make an excellent point. We do have to talk about how we're going to organize and work within ourselves and within the feminist agenda. And that's exactly what we're going to do tomorrow. Today, we're drawing our roadmap. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about how we get there, and we get there together. One last note. Do you want to do it?
Just on that, just to answer, can you also be thinking about what you're going to do next? Because I think that movement-building element must not be lost. And we've got some fantastic donors in the room. We do need to get together more often. I think that is the message that's coming over, because we want to share and build alliances, and it's getting more and more hard to do so because of the lack of funding.
Thanks. Three very quick points. The first one is related to what Lola said about counterterrorism. And we see an increased tendency to link the women, peace and security agenda with the CV agenda. And I think that poses a lot of risks, and the women, peace and security agenda should be promoted in its own right and not be undermined by a CV and CT agenda, which is fundamentally flawed and which undermines women's rights on the ground. Secondly, this sounds very obvious, but actually giving space to civil society to participate in a meaningful way in key forums at the UN. I participated in the HPF, and I actually heard a UN official saying that member states risked being crowded out, when the HPF was basically a whole forum for member states. So I think we need to think about how the UN actually can provide those spaces in terms of preparation, in terms of giving society a chance for a fair hearing. And thirdly, very quickly, I think men and masculinities and patriarchal gender norms and power relations need to be more at the forefront of the UN's agenda. it's not. Like the last UN Security Council resolution included a passing reference to men and boys, but nothing about the bigger picture when it comes to patriarchy. Thanks.
All right, we're going back to the middle again, so we'll go 1, 2, 3.
Yes. Actually, I want to follow on. Can you hear me? Okay. I want to follow on what Rula has started concerning the Anti-Terrorism Act and policies, etc. And this is something I don't know what to do with the UN, how to deal with the UN about it. The vetting process that we see back home. So, for instance, in Palestine, you cannot work with Hamas supporters and Hamas groups. This applies to the UN and it applies to other internationals. But today, the European Union and all its calls for proposals, they're not willing to support any activity that has to do with BDS. And we know it starts either with the Europeans or with the Americans, and then it moves to the UN. So what we're expecting, tomorrow the UN will actually ban any activities that have to do with the BDS. So being preventive, like how to make the UN to prevent not only conflicts, etc. This is part of the issue. This is one thing. The other thing has to do with the reform, feminism, and I was thinking, is it enough for engendering the UN to appoint more women in certain UN agencies? Actually, what I saw from such appointments, though I'm for appointing more women, but actually we're increasing the budget. We're adding more budgets to the UN, and we don't really see it translated or transforming the body, which means that it's not only to appoint a woman, but actually looking into the mandate of every UN arm. We don't need new mechanisms. I'm not for new mechanisms and the new reports, but actually revisiting the mandates. Third point, which is the list that we have made so far. So it's actually accepting the rules and trying to do the maneuver within the rules to make them look better. Or we also have another alternative discourse that says, let's start a revolution. And when I say that, I'm not for taking down the UN. This is not the thing. But for instance, yesterday I heard somebody talking about moving the UN building from New York to another country where it could receive or willing to receive people from all countries, backgrounds, etc. Can't we ask for that as far as we're making a list? This is one thing. The other thing that I didn't hear very loudly yesterday, though I personally mentioned it in our groups, like how would you convince me and convince the people I was putting on Facebook some posts, and I'm getting reactions from Palestinians. How would you convince me there will be justice for women when Saudi Arabia is leading the status? This is, but also by the same token, and this is the response again from Palestine, when Israel is leading the legal committee. How would you convince me a reform is possible with such structure? So as a feminist, again, I'm not for taking down the structure, but I want to think differently, and I want to think out of the box without really being like the Secretary General of the UN, and we make jokes about him, I'm sorry. He's always concerned, but he doesn't take any position, but concerned and concerned and concerned. So in this space where I felt we really have freedom to talk and think and also dream. And this is what I liked about women coming together, because we really can think bigger than the boxes that we work within. Can we dream of a different approach, a different idea? Yesterday I raised the idea of, maybe tomorrow I'll share it again, of having a shadow UN that is that constitutes of women, only women, trying to do the right when the men and the male dominant institution is doing the wrong. Can we think of that? It doesn't cost money. I think it only costs the will of all of us together. Can we do that? I'll ask the question tomorrow again. Thank you.
Okay, we have right here. Where's Lupa? I'll come back. I promise.
Yeah, okay. Very short.
Doesn't work. Oh, yes. Thank you very much. My name is Eli Pradavan from the Women's World Summit Foundation, based in Switzerland, but we work around the world. In my network to empower rural women, we are in 130 countries, and we hear from the field what the women need. So my point for your list of these recommendations, I think there needs to be a topic on transformation, transforming and revamping the name of the United Nations to fit the new era, and especially the new 2030 agenda, transforming our world. And we believe that the time has come, as WILPF stated, to reclaim the United Nations as a peace organization. And I would like to add, to reclaim the United Serving Nations for peace and human rights. And in this way, the people of the world will know what we are really working for. And I think, to follow my predecessor, yes, we need a revolution for the women to be heard on that new transformation. And we also need to transform the Security Council into a peace council, to transform the, what has it got? The ministries for defense to ministries for peace, and the entire peace agenda, and WILPF can be the lead in this global transformation. And if we have to do it out of the box, as what you just said, as an alternative or whatever, let's do it. We have nothing to lose. We have been in this position for how many years? Nothing is really moving forward. So why are we not going to announce via social media and all the wonderful technology that the women of the world are uniting? Join WILPF in transforming the UN to become a serving nations committee for peace and human rights. Thank you.
United Serving Nations, huh? It's pretty good. All right, we got one here, and then we're going to go to Lopa, and we're going to go back around.
Very fast. We have a very important protocol signed by the Special Rapporteur for the sexual violence, Zainab Bangura, with the government of Iraq, regarding the sexual violence done by Daesh. And actually, I don't know, and how you guys, you all here in this big organization, how we can help to push this protocols to work. Thank you.
We have good news that Pramila Patton is now taking over as one of our heroes. She hails from the CEDAW committee, and she's committed, so things are already getting a little better. Lupa.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to actually respond to a couple of things, and it's an ask as you discuss the how tomorrow. So just to say that some of these issues that were raised, one, how does Saudi Arabia get onto the Commission on the Status of Women? The ECOSOC accreditation process, the issues around CSW and access for NGOs to the negotiations. Now, so ECOSOC is the Economic and Social Commission is a group of member states. The NGO committee that decides on ECOSOC accreditation is a group of member states. The decision on the Commission on the Status of Women, the Commission on the Status of Women is a group of member states. So, the decision-making bodies within the United Nations, so the United Nations is the funds and programs, the agencies, and then it's the member states. All of the agencies, their governing bodies, are all member states. So there really needs to be a set of strategies. Yesterday I talked about the fact that there are established strategies and structures of exclusion within the UN. These are historically built. They were not meant as that, but they've turned into that. So there really need to be countervailing structures and strategies. So for example, on the whole issue of CSW, and I'm going to be very radical now. So on the issue of CSW, CSW is the space that attracts the largest number of civil society organizations of any UN intergovernmental body or discussion space. If civil society were to really mobilize together, and this is somebody was talking about the global women's movement, if there is a transnational call by civil society organizations that the Commission on the Status of Women must have representation also of civil society. As the largest body, as the space that brings the largest number of civil society organizations, the Commission must include civil society organizations. Or that's one option, that could be one strategy, or the fact that when commission members are elected by member states only. Why? Why can the commission members be elected also by civil society? Because these commissions members are elected by groups, geographical groups. So those geographical groups must include the voice of civil society. This is a suggestion. It can be promoted as a suggestion. The same goes for the NGO committee, the committee that selects NGOs for ECOSOC accreditation. It's only member states. So, again, this is an NGO selection committee. How come NGOs are not on an NGO selection committee? So again, the idea, so there really needs to be thinking out of the box in terms of what can be alternative strategies for meaningful voice and participation. It's not just about participation, it is about voice and influence, power and influence within the space. So some of these ideas that need to be put forward as alternative structures for inclusion. And one last thing, there are some good practices, but they don't travel. So for example, the way the Sustainable Development Goals process was, and the meaningful participation of civil society in the whole Sustainable Development Goals process, where space was made through the major groups system. That is not carried through into CSW. That is not carried through into the Human Rights Council. That is not carried through into other spaces. Why not? And again, they are deliberately excluded. It is said that one doesn't carry through to the other. So why are there not new structures set in place that look at good practice transfer within the UN itself?
Pretty concrete recommendations, right? Let's get NGO representation in these UN bodies.
I've got a great idea. Let's demand it, seriously. Let's make those demands. And if they won't do it, we boycott it. And we do our own. All the money you would have spent going to New York to stand outside in the cold trying to get in, we spend our money, we go to somewhere like Nairobi, and we have it in the sunshine.
Carol.
Thank you. So following both the theme of dreaming and some of Lopa's suggestions, the first thing I would ask is, why is it just CSW and someplace where NGOs are supposed to be represented? Why are they the only places that we should have civil society representation? And I think that one of the words that you keep on hearing is consultation. We demand consultation with women's groups. What does consultation signal? That we're not there, that we're not the decision makers, right? And do we think that being consulted with is the same thing as meaningful participation? People can ignore what you say when you are consulted with. So I think that every time we're tempted to demand consultation, what we have to do is rethink the mechanisms and why we're not in them in the first place. That's one part. Another word that I worry about in this is coordination. Like when we talk about coordination between the security and economic bodies, I think this is important, but all coordination means is that you're doing the same thing. And that doesn't talk about doing the same thing under what principles, right? So we did talk about that economic reform had to be related to human rights guarantees, for example. But I think it's really important that if we take the Charter seriously, the Charter starts with structural inequalities are the underlying causes of wars. So if we're doing peace building, there should be a standard which any kind of action that is taken is measured against, and there need to be mechanisms to do it. And that standard has to be, are these activities getting at the underlying causes, getting at the structural inequalities? And if what the activities, for example, of sort of standard neoliberal economic prescriptions for peace building, if those deepen inequalities and certainly don't do anything to transform them into less inequality, then they can't be done. They shouldn't be done. So how do we actually take basic principles of the UN, including human rights guarantees, and including the idea that the purpose is to end wars, and use those as the standards against which the other bodies' activities are measured and then coordinated, but under something?
Point, Carol. So part of this exercise, we have to think about how we're going to define our terminology in terms of our demands, and how we're going to define our standards to which our demands are measured for inclusivity and participation. And to remember to think outside the box. We were talking about that as well, that the UN is not just CSW, which is the largest participation by activist set of any UN forum, but there's also the Indigenous Forum that happens in April. There's the Climate Change Forum that happens in May. There's Human Rights Week in December. There's Women, Peace and Security Week in October. And we see women's rights participation in all of these spaces. So we have to reclaim all of these spaces and reclaim the UN as a whole. So I'm going to move over here because there's been a hand up for a while. So.
I think I liked very much the idea of boycotting next year if we can't be there and really think about convening together globally. Imagine that we go to the instead of going to the CSW, we have a substitute meeting, convening somewhere else, and all of us and none of the NGOs are there in New York. Can you imagine the message that we convey if we just say that we cannot be in a place where we are excluded, we are not listened to, where we are not allowed to have our own space? I find it a very strong message, but coming also to more pragmatic ways of dealing with the issues, we have to think from now onwards, if we want really to change the rules of the game and try to really reclaim, as you mentioned, but I don't think we want to reclaim, but we want to change it. The whole conceptual thinking is we have to really understand what are the issues that we want and what are our claims specifically in order to start thinking. If we keep talking among ourselves, and we don't think of the mechanism to make these messages be reaching to the United Nations and to the states of the United Nations, we are speaking on and by ourselves. You know, there are attempts always how we can exclude NGOs. They're becoming too many NGOs. We cannot absorb them. We cannot have them. They're taking the space of the states. They think that we are intruding on their space. So we have to think specifically and seriously to convey the message in a way where we really can be more influential. Yesterday and during the discussions we had, I think when we speak about the UN security, we speak about as the place where to maintain security and what do you call it? I mean, now looking at the UN, it is a place where we don't find the security because there are double standards, and we Palestinians really feel that double standards taking place. There was mentioning yesterday about a UN resolution by the General Assembly about uniting for peace, which is when the Security Council is not able to maintain peace and security all around the world, then there should be the General Assembly moving around with the resolution 377. But if you look at how many times the resolution has been used, it has not been used. And therefore we see double standards. Sometimes we look at issues being addressed under Chapter 7, but most of the times they do not want to put sanctions. And as a Palestinian, I tell you, there are numerous resolutions in favor of the Palestinian people, but when it comes to Chapter 7 imposing sanctions on Israel, everybody backs up, and there's like a fear and threat to do something about it. If we want really to maintain peace and bring in the United Nations as a peace organization, the first priority should be human rights as the priority of anything we do. Human rights is not a slogan or it's really being put into practice. And therefore, in resolving any conflicts in the world, don't tell us as Palestinians, sit with your counterparts, the Israelis, under the auspices of the United States and resolve your problems. I think international conferences where we have human rights as our priority, because all the agreements that are happening without taking into consideration human rights are failing. And therefore, human rights, self-determination on our civil political rights, economic cultural rights should be basically built on the issue of human rights in order to make it sustainable. And therefore, we think that we are always put in this vicious circle of resolving the conflicts or bringing in transitional justice without anybody's intervention or with the intervention of the biased parts of the world. So to really be able to achieve peace and security, we want to make sure that women are being included in peace talks and negotiations, but also this should be done in international conferences, if under the auspices of the United Nations, with strong representation of women and civil society. And that's how we can really convey the messages and ensure that we have real sustainable development. We also need to revisit the role of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN agencies. And in our talks yesterday, we realized that there were a lot of talks about competition on the resources and on doing the work on our behalf on the ground. The role of the UN agencies should be revisited seriously. And since we heard that the office is, the OCHR is reviewing their strategies, we have to be strong. We should come strong and say, don't do the job that we have to do locally and with our people. You have to assist us to do our work, but you should not compete on our resources in order to do the work. And finally, I think that yesterday, and it was said more than once, we need to convene. I don't understand why we don't have the 5th Women's Conference taking place, because that is a space where we can use it to strategize and develop our ideas and think globally of women's issues that we can address and discuss at the international level. So perhaps next year, or maybe in 2020, as you mentioned, if we need to prepare, but if perhaps next year, if we don't convene in the CSW, where we spend a lot of money to reach there, and funds, and we allocate that in order to be present and speak, then we can think of using that for a global meeting where we all of us could convene and talk and address the issues under the auspices of WILPF or other organizations that think that they could come on board with us on that issue. Thank you.
I think you made some great points. I just wanted to make one comment, which is that we have to think about this issue